To the extent that he is remembered at all today, William Lowndes Yancey is known as the fire eater who led the walkout of Southern delegates at the 1860 Democratic Convention in Charleston, splitting the party and paving the way for Abraham Lincoln's election, Southern secession, and ultimately Civil War. But in his youth, part of which he spent in South Carolina, Yancey had been a proud Unionist, outspoken in his opposition to John C. Calhoun's doctrine of nullification. And in 1838, when he was 24, he killed his wife's uncle in a fight prompted by Yancey's insult of a pro-nullification politician. Born in Georgia, Yancey's early life was shaped by tragedy and abuse. His biological father died of yellow fever in 1815, the year after Yancey was born. 6 years later, his mother Caroline married the Reverend Nathan Sidney Smith Beeman, a New England transplant who headed Mount Zion Academy, a Presbyterian school where Yancey studied. After selling Caroline's slaves, Beeman moved the family to Troy, New York in 1823 and joined the abolitionist movement, denouncing all aspects of slavery from the pulpit, even though he had owned and sold slaves. Yancey despised his stepfather's hypocrisy and projected it onto all abolitionists. It didn't help matters that Beeman and his wife both abused each other, their children, and their servants, both physically and emotionally. Yancey biographer Eric H. Walther writes that, for most of his life, Yancey would exhibit signs of low self-esteem and depression, unleash his own pent-up anger and rage, fiercely attack authority figures, and desperately try to defend his family and its good name, all classic consequences of childhood abuse. Yancey enrolled at Williams College in 1830, where he developed what became legendary public speaking abilities, but left in 1833. Years later, after Yancey earned a national reputation for violence, two northern newspapers would run stories claiming he was kicked out for throwing a pickle barrel through the window of a local church. Whatever the truth of that rumor, Yancey left the North, returning briefly to Georgia before moving to Greenville, South Carolina, where he studied law under the Unionist Benjamin Perry and participated in the nullification crisis on the anti-Calhoun side. In a 4th of July oration, he declared, "Designing men have, indeed, effectually destroyed, in the minds of but too many in our state, the charm which has, until of late, invested our federal union. Who can look at the last few years and not see the evident tendency of their proceedings to be disunion and a Southern Confederacy?" Later in life, Yancey would become one of those designing men. For now, he became editor of the Greenville Mountaineer, a Unionist newspaper, using his platform to rail against nullification and Calhoun's theories of government. In August 1835, he married Sarah Caroline Earle, daughter of a wealthy Greenville family, gaining 35 slaves and entry into the planter class. The next year, he bought land in Alabama and moved west. While his new home was being built, he lived with an uncle, Jesse Bean, who was a prominent states' rights leader in Alabama and began to influence the impressionable young man's views. Yancey even found himself admiring Calhoun thanks to the latter's efforts to get the U.S. Senate to implement a gag rule already in place in the House, prohibiting the discussion in Congress of anti-slavery issues. Now editing and publishing the Cahaba Southern Democrat, Yancey launched increasingly extreme attacks on the Whig Party, reserving special venom for Henry Clay and his membership in the American Colonization Society, the true aim of which, Yancey wrote, was abolition. But Yancey was still a Unionist when he traveled back to Greenville for a visit in 1838, his fortunes shaken by the Panic of 1837 and his emotions reeling from the death of his 6-month-old son. In Greenville, he attended a congressional candidates debate between Waddy Thompson and Joseph Whitner. Because Thompson had sided with the nullifiers when Yancey lived in South Carolina, Yancey called him a blackguard, a scoundrel, at a small gathering afterward. Walther writes in his book The Fire Eaters that Thompson's 17-year-old nephew, Elias Earle, took offense. Yancey and the young Earle, who was also Sarah's cousin, struck each other repeatedly but parted peacefully. After hearing his son's story, Dr. Robinson Earle, Sarah's uncle, became enraged and set off for Greenville, armed with a heavy walking stick and a small pocket knife, to find Yancey. Yancey hoped to reason with the elder and much larger Earle, but he also took a knife, a sword stick, and a pistol. After an abortive effort to talk calmly, Earl called Yancey a goddamned liar. From his jail cell, Yancey later recalled, "I then got my passions aroused. I told him to take back what he had said or take a shot." Earl refused to retract his words and advanced on Yancey, his cane raised menacingly over his head. The two scuffled. Yancey fired at close range, beat Earl on the head with his empty gun, and was in the act of running him through with a knife when the two were separated. Earl died later that night. A month later, Yancey was tried, found guilty of manslaughter, sentenced to a year in jail, and fined $1,500. Yancey showed no remorse. He boasted to his brother, "I have done my duty as a man, and he who grossly insulted me lies now with the clod upon his bosom." The episode would serve as a warning to others who feel like browbeating a Yancey. He was released after serving 3 months, and $1,000 of his fine was returned. Yancey had already developed obsessively pro-slavery views and a hair-trigger temper before turning 25 and abandoning unionism. In the next episode, we'll explore his transformation into a fire-eating disunionist and his role in dismembering the last remaining national political party. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video. When we last left William Lowndes Yancey in the previous episode, he had served 3 months in jail for killing his wife's uncle in a fight sparked by the unionist Yancey's insult of a pro-nullification politician in 1838. Fast forward to October 29, 1860, just before Abraham Lincoln's election, when the Virginia fire eater Edmund Ruffin sent Yancey a flattering appeal. "All that we now need is another Patrick Henry. Doubtless we have many men in the South who, when they shall have once taken the right direction and means of effort, may compare with that great defender of freedom and his country's rights in patriotism and zeal and self-devotion. But you also are gifted, and in a remarkable and rare degree, with the power of eloquence, and through it with power to sway the popular will, which enables one man to exercise as much influence as thousands could without this means and power for putting their intellect and patriotism to public use. Will you undertake it? Will you be the Henry for this now impending contest?" What shaped Yancey's transformation from pro-Union manslaughterer to the Patrick Henry of secession? Part of it was the influence of his uncle, Jesse Bean, a prominent states' rights politician, and Bean's friend Dixon Hall Lewis, quite literally a heavyweight of the Alabama Democratic Party, who tipped the scales at nearly 500 pounds. With their support in 1840, Yancey and his brother Ben launched a weekly campaign newspaper called The Southern Crisis, devoted to attacking Whig presidential candidate William Henry Harrison. Yancey demagogued relentlessly on Tipica News' supposed abolition principles and gleefully reprinted a Cincinnati newspaper's allegation that the incumbent, Martin Van Buren, was a Northern man with Southern principles. In reality, both candidates had difficulty straddling slavery issues, and historian William J. Cooper writes that for Southern politicians of both the Whig and Democratic parties, successfully presenting their pro-Southern case formed only one half of their political task. To cement that success, they had to portray their political enemy, both individual and party, as less than fully alert in protecting the treasure of Southern liberty. Still, Yancey seems to have believed his own anti-Harrison hype. Yancey biographer Eric H. Walther writes that the prospect of a Harrison administration truly filled Yancey with dread and helped accelerate his philosophical conversion to the states' rights school. No longer did he claim that the federal government was sovereign. He now agreed with John C. Calhoun, Dixon Lewis, and their ilk that the Constitution was made up of none but specific powers granted to it by the several sovereign states. Like his old adversary and new hero, Calhoun, Yancey now sadly concluded that unless Northerners stopped abolition fanaticism, then a separation of the Union must take place. He did not yet advocate disunion, but by the summer of 1840, his unconditional unionism was dead forever. Harrison won the presidency, but Van Buren carried Alabama, doing especially well in Yancey's Coosa County. Yancey's efforts did not go unnoticed. During the 1840s, he served sporadically in elected office, with brief stints in the lower house of the Alabama Assembly, the Alabama Senate, and the U.S. House of Representatives, where his most notable action was engaging in a duel with Thomas Clingman, a North Carolina Whig who had opposed the annexation of Texas and taken offense to critical remarks by Yancey. Both men missed their shots and left feeling their honor had been sufficiently vindicated. But Yancey, who resigned from Congress in 1846 and became an outspoken, full-blown secessionist during the national debate over the Compromise of 1850, was more at home as an outside agitator than as a lawmaker. Walther writes that, by keeping himself relentlessly in the public eye as an attorney, public speaker, state party organizer, and creator of secessionist organizations, Yancey successfully planted the idea that the Union existed only as a means towards certain ends, specifically white Southerners' rights and interest in slavery, and that if the Union ceased to fulfill its mandate, a glorious alternative awaited after secession. These ideas placed him at the center of a loose regional network of disunionists, men such as Robert Barnwell Rhett, James DeBow, Louis Wigfall, and Edmund Ruffin, and provided the foundation for his stance at the fateful Democratic Convention of 1860 and the national speaking tour that followed. During the late 1840s and 1850s, Yancey found Southern unity as elusive as John C. Calhoun had. As a delegate to the 1848 Democratic Convention, he tried unsuccessfully to get the nominee, Lewis Cass of Michigan, and the party to adopt a set of proposals he had drafted and that the Alabama State Democratic Convention had passed. The Alabama platform forbade Congress from interfering with the expansion of slavery into the territories and barred Alabama delegates to the National Convention from supporting any presidential candidate who failed to endorse the platform. When the convention overwhelmingly rejected the Alabama platform, Yancey and one other delegate stormed out. He adopted Calhoun's suspicion of political parties and was largely estranged from the Democrats for most of the 1850s, although he did align with them during the 1856 campaign to oppose the emergence of the Know-Nothing Party. This was partly because of his pro-immigration views, partly because he was disturbed by the party's stance against Catholics, and partly because he saw it as a fundamentally Northern party allied with abolitionists. Of course, the far greater threat to Southern interests came from the new Republican Party. Despite not carrying any Southern states, it came just 3 states shy of capturing the presidency in 1856. This raised the stakes in 1860, making Democratic unity essential, but Yancey again brought the Alabama platform to the convention, which was held in Charleston, South Carolina. This time he saw it accepted by the majority of the platform committee, only to be outvoted on the floor by delegates backing Stephen A. Douglas as the presidential nominee. This time Yancey's walkout was joined by delegates from 7 Southern states. A separate convention nominated Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Yancey vigorously campaigned for him across the country, even in the North, but predictably, Lincoln won the election with 39% of the vote and without the support of a single Southern state. Within a few months, 7 states, including Alabama, had seceded and sent delegates to Montgomery to form a new Southern Confederacy. Walther, in his book The Fire Eaters, writes, Yancey played a leading role in the Alabama Secession Convention, but after waiting 10 years for disunion, he briefly lost control of himself on the eve of his success. When one delegate suggested that secession was too important to be decided by a simple majority vote, Yancey proclaimed that Alabama's ordinance of secession, even if it be passed by the meager majority of one, would represent the will of everyone in the state. Furthermore, the champion of minority rights bellowed, "Those who shall dare oppose the action of Alabama when she assumes her independence out of the Union will become traitors, rebels against its authority, and will be dealt with as such." His outburst caused such chaos that the meeting had to adjourn for the day. After much wrangling, the secession ordinance passed by a vote of 61 to 39, and an exhausted Yancey wrote his brother Ben that, "I have no idea of ever again returning to public life." But soon, the incoming president, Jefferson Davis, would have just such an idea. The next episode will cover Yancey's sometimes surprising record as a Confederate diplomat and senator. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video. In early 1861, the Alabama fire eater William Lowndes Yancey was tired but satisfied. The previous summer, He had led the Southern walkout at the Democratic Convention, splitting the last remaining national political party in the U.S. This maneuver ensured the election of Abraham Lincoln, the nominee of the Northern Sectional Republican Party, but that lent urgency to the cause he'd been working toward for a decade, secession. Yancey and other fire eaters were able to stoke enough fears of Republican domination that secession conventions in 7 of the slaveholding states, including Alabama, voted to leave the Union and form a Southern Confederacy. Best of all, Yancey's city of Montgomery was to be the provisional capital and was thus experiencing a population explosion as delegates and office seekers swarmed the hitherto sleepy southern town. Yancey, who'd had his financial ups and downs, now owned a dairy farm and was set to make a mint selling milk to all those new arrivals. "I have no idea of ever again returning to public life," Yancey wrote his brother Ben. "Let other men figure out how to run the new country he'd helped create." But it turned out the new president had an unlikely assignment in mind for Yancey. For some reason, Jefferson Davis picked Yancey, a notorious hothead, a fierce champion of slavery, and one of the most inflammatory orators of his generation, to head up a 3-man mission to Europe seeking recognition and aid. And for some reason, Yancey, whose brother and one friend after another told to turn down the job, that he was being set up to fail, said yes. Historian William C. Davis writes that the president's inability to delegate hindered Yancey's team from the outset. Davis would give them no unilateral power at all to negotiate and conclude treaties. They were empowered only to meet foreign heads of state and present their case for independence and recognition. Implicit, of course, was the veiled threat that there might be a cut in the supply of cotton to Europe's mills otherwise. Even Toombs thought it pointless. He wanted to offer Europe possible lures like favored nation trading status, and for the first time found himself in agreement with Robert Barnwell Rhett, who chaired the Foreign Relations Committee. Rhett wanted the lowest possible import duties to be imposed at guaranteed rates for 20 years for nations that recognized the Confederacy, as well as free entry into Confederate ports. When Rhett found out that Davis's instructions to Yancey embraced nothing of the sort, he stormed to his friend's house and told him he had no business even going abroad if he had nothing to offer. As if those hindrances weren't enough, dispatches from Robert Bunch, the British consul in Charleston, to Foreign Secretary John Russell derided Yancey as impulsive, erratic, and hot-headed, a rabid secessionist, a favorer of a revival of the slave trade, and a filibuster of the extremist type of manifest destiny. Yancey had indeed spent much of the 1850s agitating for a revival of the African slave trade. Interestingly, however, Yancey biographer Eric H. Walther notes that at Alabama's secession convention, Yancey claimed to have changed his mind. With no more sectional conflict, with the homogeneous people accustomed to slavery, holding it in reverence for its origins and its effects, the need to obtain more slaves beyond natural reproduction no longer existed. The convention voted unanimously, with Yancey's blessings, to instruct its delegates to the February 4th meeting to press for a ban of the African slave trade. The ban did indeed make it into the Confederate Constitution, as we've discussed in a previous video, and Yancey's reversal on the issue reminds me of what historian Emory M. Thomas called the Confederacy is a revolutionary experience, writing that for 4 brief years, Southerners took charge of their own destiny. In so doing, they tested their institutions and sacred cows, found them wanting, and redefined them. In a sense, the Confederacy was the crucible of Southernism. Shortly after Yancey's arrival in London, word reached Britain about the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. This was followed by news of Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops to subdue the rebellion, which prompted the secessions of Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Confederates soon decided to move the capital from Montgomery to Richmond, Virginia, thus dashing Yancey's hopes for his dairy business. Walther writes that Britain's uncertain role in the American drama suddenly became murkier. Prime Minister Lord Palmerston and Russell had despaired over the prospect of an American Civil War, both on humanitarian grounds and for the trade and diplomatic complications that were bound to adversely affect their empire. With the secession of 4 more states, the Confederacy became a much more formidable military power, and the remaining truncated Union that much weaker. And however questionable Yancey was as the chief Confederate commissioner to Europe, Lincoln's new Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, represented a powerful counterweight. As early as January, the mere thought that Lincoln might select the feisty New York senator infuriated the British. I have more about the tensions between Seward and Britain in this week's companion post on my website, which you can access for free by clicking the link in the description below the video. For now, suffice to say that Seward's bellicosity unwittingly helped pave the way for 2 meetings between Russell and the Confederate commissioners, resulting in Britain's decision to grant the Confederacy status as a belligerent, though stopping short of full recognition as a sovereign nation. France soon followed suit. Still, those conversations and others made Yancey realize that British public opinion was entirely opposed to slavery, and that the sincerity and universality of this feeling embarrasses the government in dealing with the questions of our recognition. Pierre Rost, whom Yancey sent on to Paris, found a similarly mixed picture, and it would soon become clear that Britain and France preferred to act in tandem with regard to the thorny diplomatic issues surrounding recognition. Meanwhile, Yancey was able to cultivate an alliance with John Laird, a member of Parliament who owned a shipbuilding company with his brothers, Walter writes. By June 1862, Confederate agents contracted with the Laird brothers to construct a cruiser named the CSS Alabama, which proved devastating to Union ships. Later, the Laird shipyards also produced 2 ironclad rams for the Confederacy. Laird and Yancey got along so well that the former had Yancey visit his country home for a few days in May. Despite the many critical drawbacks that Yancey had as a diplomat, clearly his unusual personal fascination and influence worked well in small official circles. Nevertheless, it was clear to Yancey by late August that recognition would depend on the tide of war, not diplomacy, and he decided to resign his commission and return to Alabama, although due to delays in communications in the arrival of his replacements, he was not able to leave until February 1862. Summarizing Yancey's diplomatic tenure, Walther writes, "Considering Yancey's lack of experience, scant preparation, propensity to explode emotionally, and the insubstantial backing of the Davis administration, he certainly performed better than most could have imagined, and as well as anyone could have under the circumstances. He restrained his temper and his natural inclination to take the stump for a cause. He proved disarming, if not charming, to hostile and skeptical listeners. Yancey worked as a team leader, and for the first time in his life aimed at accomplishing the possible while striving for the ideal rather than the other way around. He opened and maintained dialogue with politicians and established important connections with financial and industrial leaders." Nevertheless, Yancey returned to the South disheartened by his realization that, important as cotton is, it is not king in Europe. When he disembarked in New Orleans, he told a crowd, "We cannot look for any sympathy or help from abroad. We must rely on ourselves alone." The Alabama legislature elected Yancey to the Confederate Senate. Walther writes in his book The Fire Eaters that he arrived at the Capitol in Richmond a month later, still haunted by the failure of his mission. Hopeless despair was written on his face, a friend remembered. The failure affected him like a personal execution. He seemed literally to have perished with his hopes. The concluding episode of our William Yancey series will focus on his experience as a Confederate senator. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone who might be interested. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. In early 1862, Jefferson Davis, the provisional Confederate president, was inaugurated for a full 6-year term, and the unicameral Provisional Confederate Congress gave way to the first regular Confederate Congress, which now included a Senate. Historian William C. Davis writes that the new Congress convened amidst a series of setbacks on the battlefield, from the fall of Fort Henry on the Tennessee River in early February to the fall of New Orleans on April 25th. Now everything seemed stained, from Congress's point of view. Texas member Peter W. Gray noticed what Vice President Alexander Stephens and others would comment upon in later days, that the caliber of the members had declined somewhat from that of the Provisional Congress. It had been composed of the best and most patriotic, and many of them had chosen to enlist or raise regiments rather than continue to sit in a legislature, leaving their seats to be filled in too many cases by lesser men. One of the new senators was William Lowndes Yancey, the Alabama fire reader who had recently wrapped up an unlikely period of service as a diplomat struggling against overwhelming odds to win European recognition and aid for the new country he had helped bring into being. Unable to leave London until February, he did not reach Richmond, Virginia, the new Confederate capital, until March 28th, less than a month before the first session ended. He was appearing in a National Assembly for the first time since resigning from the U.S. Congress 16 years before. Would he prove to be one of the best and most patriotic, or one of the lesser men? Yancey's first major vote came April 16th when he joined majorities in both houses in granting President Davis's request for the first military draft on the North American continent, mandating a 3-year term of service for all able-bodied white men aged 18 to 35 and requiring 1-year volunteers already in uniform to remain active another 2 years. As historian Emory M. Thomas notes, this was a significant step toward improving Confederate military strength and away from the traditions of state rights and individualism characteristic of the antebellum South. And Congress did not make the draft more palatable when, in October 1862, in the name of exemption reform, it exempted owners or overseers of 20 or more slaves. This species of class exemption stimulated class conflict. Southern yeomen resented so blatant a symbol of the rich man's war as poor man's fight. Conscription, more than any other issue, exposed latent conflict between state and national government in the South. This was quite a concession for someone like Yancey, whose name was as synonymous with states' rights as anyone alive in 1862. And his personal transformation was mirrored by that of the South at large, now that it was a nation fighting to preserve its independence, which for many Southerners became the most important end unto itself, rather than a means to pursue other ends. Again citing Thomas, this time in another book, however much the Confederates wanted to alter their political doctrine, or however much they were forced to do so by circumstances, the alteration occurred. It occurred within a nation supposedly fighting to defend the doctrine of state rights, and thus the political transformation was part of the internal revolution in the wartime South. Goaded by the demands of a modern, total war, the Confederate government abandoned the political system it was called into being to defend. The Confederacy raised a national army, conscripted troops, employed martial rule, managed the economy, and even interfered with Southern stills. The state and local governments expanded their powers in like measure. And all the while, the bodies of Jefferson and Calhoun whirled in their graves. The realities of wartime did not cause Yancey to abandon completely his state rights ideals. Despite having voted for conscription, he often warned against the creeping expansion of central government powers and of military authority over civil life. He saw moves by Davis and his congressional supporters to create a Confederate Supreme Court as a threat to state sovereignty. Yancey biographer Eric H. Walther lays out Yancey's reasoning. The separate sovereign states created the court. It therefore could not possess the power to declare constitutional something that any or all of the states considered unconstitutional. He warned the Senate, when you strain the powers of the central government against the states, you will have a war of intellect, which will soon become a moral war, and the flashing of judgments will soon become a flashing of swords. Although Yancey's diplomatic tenure had done much to cool his fiery temper, it flashed again during debates over the Supreme Court when things got personal between himself and Senator Benjamin Hill of Georgia. When Yancey was called upon to apologize on February 4, 1863, Walther writes in his book The Fire Readers that, although Yancey vehemently denied uttering anything offensive, he said he wished he had done so. "You had better then do so now," Hill cried. Yancey stated calmly that he had already said everything a gentleman could say, and he started to sit down when I was shocked by a blow of great severity upon my cheekbone, just below the outer corner of my right eye and the temple, which immediately flooded my collar, neck, and bosom with blood. The culprit was a glass inkstand, which Hill had hurled at Yancey, who rose to attack Hill, only to have Hill throw a second inkstand, this time missing. Their colleagues broke up the row, and Walther writes, although no one recorded what Yancey had said in the secret session to provoke Hill, the Confederate Senate censured Yancey and not Hill for the incident. The facial wound Yancey received in February healed quickly, but his chronic medical problems worsened by summer. Afflicted with fever and a serious kidney ailment, Yancey remained in bed from July 2nd until his death on July 27, 1863. Yancey, who had constantly battled health problems, died a couple weeks shy of his 49th birthday. He at least had the consolation of dying a citizen of the Confederacy, but he had lived long enough to get news of the fall of Vicksburg, which he blamed on Jefferson Davis. Yancey and the president had squabbled over a patronage appointment and a few similarly petty misunderstandings, but had begun to patch things up when Yancey died. William C. Davis writes that, in his will, Yancey left Davis a telescope that once belonged to George Washington, perhaps a sign that all was forgiven, though Yancey's wife actually blamed Davis for the illness that killed her husband. Sadly, the glass did nothing to improve Davis's vision of how to deal with men as autocratic and independent as himself. Yancey was widely eulogized throughout the Confederacy, with the Montgomery Advertiser saying Yancey was to the politics of the country what Stonewall Jackson was to the field. In the long run, his legacy largely faded, although in 1966 the notorious Alabama governor George Wallace named a community college near Mobile after him, only to have the school change its name 4 years later. And in 1995 he was inducted into the Alabama Men's Hall of Fame, along with company he would never have imagined: Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, and Sequoyah. That concludes our biographical series on the turbulent life of William Lowndes Yancey. I think it shows that in many ways he was transformed by the realities of the new country he helped bring about, and one can only speculate on how he might have changed further had he lived longer. Be sure to check out the other episodes if you missed them, and let me know what you think in the comments. As always, there's additional context in the companion post on my website, and don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share with anyone who might be interested. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.